And so I kind of want to like shift gears and talk about the 2019 University of Michigan study. When that came out, really what I would like to do is have you point out what are the three main things that you found were just the most fascinating about that in the conversation of endogenous DMT. What did that teach us, and why did you decide we need to make a film about that study specifically?
Yeah, so prior to the 2019 study, the most recent endogenous DMT study was the microdialysis one that took place at Jima Borjigin's lab in Michigan, about the pineal gland producing DMT and the pineal gland having the enzymes to produce DMT. So after that study, it was just speculation basically for 6 years about, well, can the pineal gland produce enough DMT to have any physiological or neurological effect? And there was just still, it was so speculative. So the 2019 paper pretty much shattered all the speculation. It just changed the whole conversation altogether based on the fact that John Dean found that the brain, the extracellular fluid of the brain, they're basically in live waking rats, not in the dream sleep, not in an altered state, just in normal live waking rats. DMT levels in the extracellular fluid of the brain, in which they took samples of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, they found that DMT, a hallucinogen, is produced at similar levels to those commonly studied neurotransmitters. So that's first and foremost. That's the first important one. The second important point of that study was that the machinery to produce DMT. So in neuroscience, a lot of times there's difficulties in measuring direct aspects of what you're looking for. So you measure a slight periphery, like you measure the enzymes capable to produce a compound, and that is going to be what you use as, considered to be proof, scientific proof. So Dean found the two enzymes necessary, INMT and AADC, that they weren't found just in the pineal gland, but he found them in the choroid plexus as well as the cerebral cortex of the rats, all throughout. So that changed the conversation of whether the pineal gland is capable of producing enough DMT to cause a physiological effect. To it's obvious that DMT is produced in many parts of the brain, so it seems like there's likely an important role for it. And then the third part of the study, which was a little bit, I would say it could have been done a little bit cleaner. Even John Dean will agree with me in this, but he did find that endogenous DMT levels were increased by 600% following cardiac arrest in rats. The only criticism of that part of the study was that it wasn't based like on a minute by minute measurement directly after cardiac arrest. That 600% increase was measured, I think, multiple minutes after the cardiac arrest had taken place. So they're at some point, I think they're going to want to redo that on a minute by minute basis in a similar way they had done other cardiac arrest studies in rats. But yeah, that's the basis of those three data points of the paper. And, I saw that the potential implications were huge in terms of changing the entire narrative about endogenous DMT. So, I saw it getting a little bit of publicity in the psychedelic space and here and there, but I just didn't really see it as getting the big shine. Like, I figured that people that were really about mystical states and DMT would be talking about it. Like, I figured like a guy like Joe Rogan would have been like going crazy talking about it on his podcast. But like, from what I remember, he barely even mentioned it, or he didn't mention it at all. And I was like, okay, well, we're going to have to put the spotlight on this because, if you're interested in DMT, if you've ever been interested in endogenous DMT, then we got to highlight this paper in a major way and highlight the fact that this entire field of endogenous DMT needs more support.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick recap. We produce more DMT than we originally thought. And it seems like it's happening all the time and throughout the brain rather than just in a single centralized location. And then on top of that, so that's in just regular waking consciousness, it seems. And then the last find is, and then it highly upregulates post a cardiac arrest experience. So that's just one example of an event that will cause an uptick. So, and what's so curious about this is, you're right. I also noticed after you pointed it out that the conversation about, like the pineal gland produces DMT, and like really this high hyper focus on the pineal gland, which I think is an amazing organ for sure, but this hyper focus on it was still happening after science had come out. And even I remember Rick Strassman saying, like as he was going through all of his work, he was like, and this is close to the next step. It's almost the last step in proving that DMT is produced in the mammalian brain. And so what I found curious about that was, like, he's even saying, like, listen, like, a lot of the times we talk about things, we're saying it's scientific, it's proven DMT is produced by the pineal gland, and he's sitting there, he said, like, so it looks like it still might be produced by the pineal gland, but that may not actually be what we've been measuring. And so you'll have people like David Nichols, I think he did a whole thing at the Breaking Convention where he's like, why are we talking about endogenous DMT? We don't produce enough of it for it to make any difference at all. We should start talking about other cascades of neurochemistry, not endogenous DMT. And then almost like clockwork, as a divine intervention, science just comes out and says, like, look at this. We produce comparable levels of DMT to things like serotonin and dopamine. It's produced all the time. It's produced in many different regions of the brain. The choroid plexus, which produces cerebrospinal fluid. Where else? There's like 2 other locations in the brain throughout the cerebral cortex, right?
And the pineal gland.
And the pineal gland. Okay. Yeah. So I find that super fascinating, and I'm super glad that we had the opportunity to make a film to show, like, listen, this is science. And I guess the thing I want to point out here is we had this conversation yesterday, actually. It's not the science that runs the mind of the masses. It's really not the science. It's the narrative that can be wrapped around it. Well, is it in an amazing article that went viral? Is it in a YouTube video that went viral? Is it in a documentary or an incredibly well-bought and well-read book out there? And if it's not, then the science alone isn't going to mean anything, because you have people like Joe Rogan, as you said, love talking about endogenous DMT, anything DMT, and even after this paper was published, even he wasn't talking about it. So really, I mean, I find that to be the best reason as to why you would have reached out to me, like, hey, listen, let's start honing in on the narrative that people are speaking about, because what I've always loved about your work is you really are showing, like, listen, it's not that we have an absence of evidence that there are things we need to look at scientifically, things that you could call the mystical experience, things that are higher cognitive abilities that throughout time, even look at Dean Radin's book, Real Magic. And there's a bunch of other books that say, like, there are tons and tons and tons of anecdotal accounts and even scientific reports showing that we need to look deeper into it. But maybe because, you can't just you can't patent it, you can't make pharmaceutical drugs that you can, net or gross a couple $1 billion off of, the funding is not there. And that's the most interesting thing, and I'm glad we got to put that at the end of a DMT Quest, is why is the funding not there? This to me is like the holy grail, understanding higher human potential. And there is a lot of science out there, but the narrative's not there, and no one's talking about it because we're so hypnotized by the pharmaceutical industry and the news telling us how to, not even telling us how to stay healthy. They're telling us what kind of interventions, pay for interventions we should use if there's some kind of health risk out there. So your thoughts on, like, how do we make the biggest impact? How do we bring this to more minds, this understanding of not just DMT, but the higher human potential?
Yeah, well, it's multi-pronged, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make the film and highlight the fact that this is an underfunded field is because there's such a renaissance with psychedelics right now, and there's a ton of money going into exogenous psychedelic research, but endogenous DMT research is still sitting on the sidelines, like, with no love. And this is not a new phenomena. I reached out to J.C. Calloway. He had published a study, I believe, in either 1986 or 1988. He proposed the hypothesis that during the dream state, endogenous DMT and the endogenous monoamine oxidase inhibitor pinoline were upregulated, leading to the dream experience. And when I emailed and asked him if he had ever tested that hypothesis, he said that there was never any funding for it. So he had to go into, I think, cannabis research or something like that. But that was his main passion, was the DMT research. And this was taking place back in the 80s, where it was a lack of funding. So, 30 years later, still in the same situation, right? Like, why are we waiting 6 years for a study to come out between 2013 and 2019 for such an intriguing topic that everybody's looking into? And then there's the narrative aspect, like you said. There wasn't enough people even paying attention to this stuff. That's what I was realizing, that much of what runs the world is the narrative. So how do you build a narrative? Either you can go ahead and get a public relations arm and try to talk to as much press as you can, or you can go ahead and build something of your own, which I thought that we did a pretty decent job of doing together with Ben. And I'm excited to work on future ones for sure. There's just so much work to be done in that space of presenting these concepts, because I think the implications are going to be massive. And I think that they don't necessarily have to go full on mystical aliens, even though they can end up there, but they can start at something much more grounded, like we presented in the first episode, and continuing in that sort of grounded perspective and building up into something absolutely mind blowing.
Make sure y'all head over to benjosephstewart.com, become a member. You'll have access to the growing library of deeper dives, where I talk about all the stuff that I really can't talk about on YouTube. Make sure you get involved in the Discord chat. That's where a lot of the conversation is happening, talking about new theories, being able to interweave into the greater conversation that is how we awaken infinity. That's our highest potential. And I just want to remind you, you are the most powerful technology ever known to creation. Wield it like an artist with a conscience.